Thank you very much. Striving for a better tomorrow. Well, if there is one message I want to get through today, is that if you want a better tomorrow, and I'm speaking especially for the younger ones in the audience, if you want a better tomorrow, then please don't remain trapped, imprisoned in what looks politically feasible now. But think about this better tomorrow, something desirable, something sustainable, all things considered, without complacency, thinking about it in a multidisciplinary way. And then it's this ideal, this utopia, that will make politically possible a number of things that are not politically possible today. One of the things that should be part of a better future is the idea I've been asked to talk to you today. It's one idea that is simple, yet powerful, a radical idea in the same league as the abolition of slavery or universal suffrage, not less utopian than those ideas, not more utopian either. It's an idea to which I devoted with a colleague a book published last year by Harvard University Press, and that came out also in the Korean language yesterday. So what I want to do then for a start is clarify this idea, because when an idea becomes popular, as has been the case in a sort of completely spectacular way in the last 2 years, when an idea becomes popular, a lot of misunderstandings arise around that idea too. So first way of clarifying that idea is by distinguishing 3 models of social protection or of basic economic security. The oldest one is social assistance. It was born at the beginning of the 16th century. The first little book that was defending it is a book entitled On the Assistance of the Poor, written by someone called Vives, of Spanish origin, who studied in Paris and then taught at the universities of Louvain and Oxford. And what he was advocating is something totally radical at the time, namely that the assistance to the poor should be organized by the public authorities, by the municipalities, and not be a matter of private charity or something organized by the church. It was experimented at the local level in various places, mainly in Flanders and in Germany, and then it was systematized at the level of a whole country with the poor laws in England from the end of the 16th century. In fact, what we have today in a number of countries, including, and to get the phrasing right, including in this country under the name of National Basic Livelihood Security, created through an act in 1999 and reformed last year, what we have today under conditional, means-tested minimum income schemes are, in fact, varieties of what was invented at the beginning of the 16th century. Indeed, so-called Hartz IV, so Arbeitslosengeld II, what Peter Haas just talked about, is in fact also one form of help of aid to the poor, of social assistance in this sense, with a number of specific features to which I shall return. The second model is totally different. It's no longer a matter of aid to the poor, it's a matter of solidarity, mutual help among the workers. It was first imagined by the Marquis de Condorcet, philosopher and mathematician at the end of the 18th century, and first implemented, introduced at the end of the 19th century, about a century later, under Bismarck, as part of the unification of Germany, the first unification of Germany at the end of the 19th century, when the first pension system, national pension system, state-organized pension system, the first invalidity, sickness pensions, later also unemployment system were introduced, and then later developed, and then spread, copied in a number of countries throughout the world. These two, namely social assistance, social insurance, make up in different proportions the bulk of our existing welfare states, with great differences in the relative weights of the two components depending on the country considered. And then there is a third model. The third model that cannot be fitted into either of the two I've just presented, which was first anticipated by Thomas Paine, the ideologue of the French and the American Revolution at the end of the 18th century, but it was really first proposed as a regular income paid to everyone in the middle of the 19th century by a certain Joseph Charlier, who published a book called Solution of the Social Problem, which he wrote in 1848 in Brussels, just in the same place, same city, same year as Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto had immediately a worldwide impact. It still has some impact, not so far away from here. And whereas this solution of the social problem was hardly read. What was the intuition beyond that? He proposed this, Joseph Charlier proposed a territorial dividend, which was meant to be an equal sharing of the rent that was associated to land. Land is privately appropriated, it's built on, so the value of that land, and indeed, with some generational delay, indeed, all the buildings, the real estate on that land, well, the value of that should be shared equally among all. That's a completely different notion. It's no longer a sort of public charity to the poor, the first model. It's not solidarity between workers who put aside part of their wages in order to be covered when some risks materialize, which is a second model. It is a third model fundamentally distinct from the other two. Does it exist today? Only in a very modest, indeed anecdotal fashion, in the state of Alaska since 1982, when a fund was created, the Permanent Alaska Fund, out of the revenues from the exploitation of oil in the north of Alaska, and a dividend on that fund is paid annually to every permanent resident of Alaska, but at a very low level, between 2 and 3% of the pretty high GDP per capita in Alaska. Now, what are the differences between basic income, which is in fact what is linked to this third model, what comes out of the third model, and the existing systems of minimum income or basic protection that belong to the model of social assistance. And by looking at these differences, you'll see how and why so many people find this idea pretty crazy, the idea of an unconditional basic income. What are the differences with social assistance? Well, there are these three differences. It's strictly individual. It is universal in the sense that it's not means-tested. And it is also obligation-free. Let me quickly go through these three fundamental differences. Strictly individual. You may say, well, as a way to alleviate poverty, this looks like a pretty silly idea, because surely there are economies of scale, so that if you want to lift people out of poverty, well, if there is a person living alone, that person should receive more per capita than if you have two people or three people, three adults living together. So it shouldn't be, the amount shouldn't be the same for everyone. Instead, a basic income is unconditional in the sense that it's strictly individual. But then when you think a bit more, you think, well, maybe this has some significant advantages, especially in today's world. One, there used to be a time in my country, probably in yours too, where living together for two adults was practically equivalent to being married to each other. Now, there are many people who are formally married to each other, but who've separated, and even more, massively more people who live together, form a household, and not married together. That means that if you want to implement this first condition with a means test, with a conditional scheme, differentiating between people depending on their housing arrangements, a lot of intrusion is required in order to go and check whether people really live together. Secondly, in fact, if you pay more when people live alone, this is, of course, a way of neutralizing the advantage, the incentive in favor of living together. And surely, in our societies, it's good that people should join households. It's good for ecological reasons, for a number of other reasons, but giving this strictly individual income is a way of giving also the weakest member of each household, usually a woman, her own income, an income of her own, something to which we may return in the course of the panel later on. So one is strictly individual, absurd at first sight, but perhaps not so much when you think about it. Two, universal, given to the rich as well as to the poor. Is that not a crazy waste of money, giving money to people who don't need it? Well, it's important to understand that giving a basic income to the rich as well as to the poor is not better for the rich. They'll pay for their own basic income, but it is better for the poor. Why is it better for the poor? For two reasons. One is what's commonly known in the jargon as the rate of take-up. With all the assistance, social assistance schemes we know, means-tested, conditional, whenever there is a good study that has been made about it, it shows that many of the poor people who are entitled to these benefits never get it or get it very late. Why? Because of a lack of information, one, and two, because of the stigmatization, the humiliation that's associated with it, to an extent that varies from country to country, depends on the fine detail of how it's administered. But in France, for example, it was studies show that about 50% of the poor people entitled to their pretty systematic minimum income scheme never get it. So that's the first reason. It's the holes in the safety net. And the second reason is that if you have an unconditional universal basic income, it means that you can combine this benefit with income from another source, and in particular with wages, including wages from mini-jobs, unstable jobs, from self-employment, without losing the benefit as a result of it. In standard schemes, doesn't apply to the reformed social help in social aid in Germany, but in the standard schemes, for any any dollar you earn in wages, you lose $1 in benefit. That's part of what is called the poverty trap. People trapped in poverty because there is no material incentive in earning, in getting a job, at least if the job is poorly paid or a part-time job. But that's not the main aspect for many people of this trap. There is also the uncertainty trap, because you are on benefit. There is a job that may pay a bit more than what you get on benefit. You would like to do it, but you don't dare to do it, because once you take the job, you lose the benefit, and you may not stick it out in that job, or you may be sacked after a while, and then you don't know whether you'll be able to get back to the benefit quickly enough, and for that reason, you prefer to play safe and stick to the situation of unemployment, situation of poverty as defined by the Social Welfare Administration. So these are the two reasons why giving benefit in a universal way to the rich as well as to the poor is better for the poor. One is the rate of take-up, the holes in the net. Two is that a basic income, unlike conditional social benefit is really a floor on which you can stand. You can combine it with income from other sources without any administrative complication. And thirdly, you have the obligation freeness. You may say again, what a ridiculous idea. So are we going to give this benefit even to the lazy, even to the people who turn down a job? And here is, of course, a fundamental difference with the reform, I mean, more generally with all the social assistance systems which have this sort of feature, but in particular with what made the Hartz IV reform and the reform which Peter has just been talking about, so controversial also in Germany, which is that it reinforced the pressure for people to accept a job if a job was recognized as zumutbar, as appropriate for that person. Basic income says no. This is unconditional in the sense of obligation-free. You give up a job in order to look better after your children, in order to get further training, in order just to breathe, in order to avoid a burnout, you are entitled to it. If some jobs are available that in principle you could do, but you find them jobs that are uninteresting for you, or that provide you with no training, whatever, you are entitled to refuse them without losing the benefit. It's absolutely crucial, I return to that, absolutely crucial in order not to turn this sort of benefit system into a sort of subsidy for the employers, providing them with cheap labor. It's essential that you should give not only purchasing power, but bargaining power to the people with least bargaining power. That's absolutely fundamental in the basic income approach. So these are the, in the meanwhile, okay, can you read that? Okay, so these are the two features. From here it's not that readable, but so these are then the three important features that distinguish a basic income from the social assistance systems we know. Now, why has it become so popular recently? There are no doubt some contingent events, and I'll quickly mention three. One, 2 years ago, so in 2016, there was a national referendum in Switzerland. You may know that Switzerland has a long tradition of direct democracy, and it's enough for 100,000 Swiss citizens to sign a request to have a referendum on a particular topic for this referendum to be organized. And if the proposal passes, it has the same status as an article in the Swiss constitution. So it's a very powerful instrument. So about 2013, there was a campaign starting in favor of what's they are called in the German part of Switzerland a Grundeinkommen, defined as something unconditional that would be sufficient, it said, the text said, to live a dignified life, but the exact amount would need to be determined by the legislator. Nevertheless, in the comments around the proposal, the initiators mentioned a particular amount, which was about $2,500 per month and per person. Very high amount, about 39% of GDP per capita in Switzerland. So, procedure is such that first the government has to give an opinion. Government said no good. 7 out of 7 members of the government unanimously they said vote against. Please, Swiss people, vote against it. The Senate, the Swiss Senate, the equivalent of the Senate in Switzerland, voted against it, 39 against 1. The second chamber, so the National Assembly of Switzerland, also voted against it in a ratio of 7 against 1. It was then put to the people, and the proposal was defeated by in a ratio of about 3 to 1. What should be concluded for that? First of all, that it was absolutely fantastic in terms of publicity for the idea. And more people than ever, not only in Switzerland, became aware of the idea and started thinking about the pros and cons. Personally, I took part in that debate, also in Geneva, in Zurich, and I told my Swedish friends, look, of course, if I were a Swiss citizen, I would say yes in your referendum, but if I were the minister in charge of implementing it tomorrow, I would resign immediately, because the sort of level they were proposing, even in the case of Switzerland, was not exactly reasonable. But thank you, Switzerland. This was excellent in terms of propagating the idea. Second event, presidential campaign in France, the latest one. And December 2016, one of the candidates for becoming the socialist candidate for president, so one of the candidates in the primaries, Benoît Hamon, came out with, out of the blue, with this idea of an unconditional basic income, revenu universel, as it was called. To many people's surprise, including mine, he won the primaries, including the second round against the former prime minister of France. Then he was defeated in the presidential election itself, partly no doubt for that reason and some confusion. He had taken on board a couple of good economists, including Thomas Piketty and his wife Julia Cagé, who tried to present the basic income as not too radical, that is, presenting it as a negative income tax, but without calling it a negative income tax, because who could be in favor of a negative income tax? That is something that is both a tax and negative, not exactly the sort of idea that will catch many votes. Moreover, in France, as elsewhere, the idea of negative income tax remains linked to Milton Friedman, and for that reason it was very difficult for a socialist candidate to defend that idea. Anyway, for strategic reasons more than substantive reasons, the socialist candidate lost both to a more left-wing candidate, Mélenchon, and to Macron, who then became president of France. Again, thank you, France. This was a remarkable contribution to getting the idea known in France and far beyond. Finally, the third last event I briefly mentioned is an experiment that is going on at the moment in Finland. There we have at the moment a right-of-center government, so it's quite different from the socialist proposal in France. And in the Swiss case, in fact, it's only among the Greens and among the socialists that the proposal had some support in Parliament. So here we have a right-of-center coalition in Finland that has decided to have an experiment, very limited experiment, 2,000 people who were initially on benefit, on the basic benefit, which is about $600 per month in Finland, and who are told henceforth for 2 years, this is unconditional. That is, you can combine it with any amount of any wages from another source, one, and two, you can also, you are no longer bullied into getting a job if you are not forced to take a job if offered, which was the conditional system which applied before, and it's also strictly individual. There was some rumor on the internet and beyond the internet, some fake news recently saying the Finnish government has interrupted its experiment, so therefore the suspicion was therefore it was not very successful. This was typical fake news. The Finnish government has always said that it would last for 2 years, not more, and it will continue until the end of this year, and the results, according to the research team, will not be available until the middle of 2019. But again, although I'll return to that, we won't learn that much from this experiment, certainly nothing about the sustainability of a basic income at that level, but again, it was a significant contribution to its to its popularity, or at least to its being known far beyond now a circle of academics and activists. So these are just 3 things. I could mention many more, including Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, in his speech at the commencement ceremony 1 year ago at Harvard, who said we should think about the idea of a universal basic income. One of the main candidates for president of Mexico at the moment, Ricardo Anaya, is pleading for universal basic income, says even in the Mexican context it makes sense. And there are also experiments or plans of experiments, basic income experiments that are being made throughout the world in less developed countries as well as in developed countries. What might be the underlying cause of these of this recent popularity? Well, I believe it's really the conjunction of two things. One, which has been referred to repeatedly already and documented, is a polarization of earning power, and especially of stable, reliable earning power. That is the outcome of the combination and the interaction, complex interaction between two phenomena. One is globalization, and the other one is the specific type of labor-saving technical change which has been happening and which, according to some, will be happening in the future at an increasing pace. And so we are already seeing some of that. So with some people, because of a winner-take-all dynamics and number of other reasons, some people who own the right sort of human capital, who own capital, who own intellectual property rights, see their earning power rise and rise and rise, because also all this is something that you from which you can get a return on a world scale. But at the same time, in a number of countries, certainly in the richer countries of the world, you have an increasing precarization of people, so that a growing number of people, even if their earning power doesn't fall below the threshold of poverty, it's above it, and people feel threatened by the possibility of falling below that. So that's one element, and people say, well, we need to do something about it. Now, when we had in the past a large proportion of people unemployed or growing precariousness in some countries, you had an immediate right-left consensus. What is the solution? The solution is further growth. So if you have this unemployment, it's a matter of getting the output growing faster than productivity, and that will be the way in which we be able to resolve this unemployment or make the jobs less precarious. But of course, what has happened over the years is an increasing doubts about the desirability of growth, and climate change being only one of its aspects, of the aspects of these doubts. And two, some people also question the very possibility of continued growth in rich countries. And of course, in a way, we've had this massive growth, not least in Korea in over the last few decennia, and yet we are stuck with large, depending on the country, either with many precarious jobs or an increase in precarity of these jobs on the one hand, or an increase in unemployment. And the conjunction of these two things have led more people to think seriously about basic income. In some cases, it takes the form of jobless future, and so because there will not be enough jobs for everyone, you need to give an income. That's not my view, but certainly there is this polarization, and we need to do something about it. Now, what could be done about it? Well, people have come to the idea that perhaps instead of going for further growth and perhaps at the expense of the health of our planet, shouldn't we enable some people who work too much to work less in such a way that will free some jobs for the others, and at the same time subsidize in a systematic way jobs that are not well paid because of their immediate productivity being fairly low. But of Of course, the danger is that you just, if you push these people into this low productivity job, this is a way of enslaving these people to jobs you and I wouldn't like to do. Therefore, it's important to combine the universality, the possibility of combining this job, the basic income and the benefit with the job. It's important to combine it with the obligation freeness, which is what gives then the worker, the individuals, the ability to discriminate between jobs that are badly paid, but promising, interesting, pleasant, versus jobs that are really shitty jobs, jobs that don't teach you anything, where you have to work under an awful job and under difficult working conditions. So let me then quickly go through some objections that are being made. I'll be very brief and just to trigger some thinking about it. Is it first, quickly, economic, in just telegraphic way, some of the economic objections. Sometimes people say, well, this is obviously unaffordable, or at least there is a dilemma between it being completely unacceptable and it being completely and clearly unaffordable. The argument takes the following form, simplifying a bit. People say, well, of course it's affordable if you take all the existing transfers, pensions, unemployment benefits, etc. You take all of that, and instead of distributing it in a differentiated way, you distribute it equally among all citizens. People say, well, that's affordable, but it's ridiculous because it would increase poverty, because you would waste this money giving to some of the people who don't need it, and at the same time reduce the benefits for people who do need it. So, affordable, yes, but totally unacceptable. Now, alternatively, you could say, no, we'll have this basic income at the same level, but we add it to all the existing benefits. And then you compute it as a fraction, as a proportion of public expenditure or proportion of GDP. And you see, well, okay, this may improve the situation of the worst off, but it is clearly unaffordable given the massive increase in the state budget this would mean. The meaningful sort of exercise is neither of these two extremes. You must think about the basic income as a modest income which you fit under the whole distribution of income. All the benefits that are lower than the basic income, and initially certainly it will be a modest basic income, all the lower benefits you scrap. All the benefits that are higher, including pensions, you reduce by the amount of the basic income. And at the same time, you reform personal income taxation in such a way that everyone starts paying tax from at 30% rate or whatever from the first dollar earned. Okay? So that means that the tax schedule will become as such more linear in a way. It will be closer to a flat tax, in a sense less progressive, but of course the whole of this you use then in order to fund at least part of the basic income. There will then be a net cost. Some people, very poor people, part-time workers will have a higher net income, so you'll need to find some additional funding, and that you'll have to find among people like me, that is people who have a pretty high income and who will need to pay a little bit more in tax on their labor without this modifying in any way their labor supply. And also it will, you'll need to try and find far more from by taxing in many sorts of ways, including those discussed before today, taxing more capital income than is the case today. We saw that the share of capital income in total income has kept growing in a number of countries, including this one, and no doubt there is room there. You may need more international cooperation than is the case than exists now in order to make that feasible, but there is certainly room there. So it is affordable while making a real difference, even at a very low level, making a difference to the level of poverty of the people, even if the level of basic income is below the poverty threshold, providing, of course, you don't scrap the benefits that are higher but simply replace the lower part of these benefits while keeping conditional top-ups. If you want to discuss then in the longer term the sustainability of higher basic incomes, let me just say that of course you need to consider the question of labor supply, but no less important is the question of borders, that is the possible selective emigration of the tax base and the possible immigration, the welfare magnet of potential beneficiaries. And even more important is the impact of basic income on human capital. And here, and this is for me really a central issue related to several things that have been said, including by Peter just a few minutes ago, which is that a basic income is meant to be a fundamental complement to lifelong learning, because a basic income is something that gives you throughout life the possibility of a more flexible back and forth between employment, training, and voluntary activities, in particular within the household. And so if you want to bring up your children properly, you need to have this possibility of reducing your working time at the time it is needed. Similarly, you need throughout life a far easier back and forth with training. And of course, you need at the same time to revolutionize our post-compulsory education system in order to make that possible. Let me then just say one brief word about the first ethical objection I mentioned there. Some people say, well, isn't that replacing the right to work by a right to an income? Absolutely not. Having access to work is important for reasons independent of, or in addition to having access to an income, for reasons that have been mentioned by several speakers before, including Peter. So this is essential, but basic income, for the reason I briefly indicated before, related to its universal nature, is a way of realizing this right to work, of making it more real for more people, not a way of giving it up. Does it scrap the duty to work? No, it doesn't scrap the duty to work in a meaningful sense of that word. And I'll skip the political objections, and I'll just mention that in an illustrative way. I've been told, or rather I read on Wikipedia, that your current president is a Catholic, is a Christian. And there may be a resistance among people in the Christian tradition against the idea of a basic income, because there is something somewhere to be found in one of the letters of St. Paul, a famous sentence that says, if you don't work, you will not eat. Okay? Now read carefully that passage. In fact, what St. Paul says in that passage is, it's not that you don't have the right to eat without working. And I went to check the Greek. The right is exousia. It's not that you don't have the right to eat without working. It's just that what we recommend is you follow our example, we and my fellow Christians, when we go and visit our friends in other cities, we don't let them do all the work. We also work with them. And of course, this moral duty to work, not in the sense of performing wage work, but in the sense of doing things that are useful for other people than yourself, will remain as important in a post-basic income world as it is in the current world. But of course, doing things that are useful for other people than yourself is not the same as performing wage work. There's quite a bit of wage work that is not exactly useful to others when you try to convince other people to buy things they absolutely don't need, versus when you are not paid for looking after your children, looking after the elderly, as mentioned before, etc. So you need to dissociate that. And of course, in a post-basic income work, don't think that you'll receive recognition, esteem, admiration just by cashing in a benefit. No, these social sanctions will remain as important as ever. Just a final word then on the steps, and I'll be very, and so it's important to have a vision about the long term, but it is also important to look at where you put your feet. And let me just say a word about experiments. There are lots of experiments going on, but they will never teach us whether basic income at a particular level is sustainable or not. Simply because one, it is just of limited duration. Two, in the Finnish experiment that didn't include any worker, anyone presently at work. And even in the best experiment of the world, you'll never be able to include people who would be net contributors to the funding of the system, nor will you be able to detect what is crucial for a basic income, which is its impact, its differentiated impact on the labor market. Basic income should make it easier to accept some jobs. That may be many jobs, but many jobs that are interesting in themselves, and the workers will be able to discriminate while making other jobs more difficult to fill. Basic income, and that's my final word, is meant to modify not mainly the distribution of income, but also distribution of bargaining power. And one day, perhaps, when the basic income will be higher enough, well, the people who clean our toilets in our universities, in our hotels, will be better paid, will need to be better paid for that job than people like me who do this sort of job for reasons that are intrinsic to the job than just for the pay. And that will simply be greater justice and part of a better, more fair future. But there are many intermediate steps to make before, and these steps we shall make more easily if we have a good sense of direction after due reflection, and if we have the force, therefore, more force, more strength in order to move in that direction. Thank you for your attention.
네, 경제 불평등의 대안으로서의 기본소득에 대해 강연해 주신 필립 반 파레이스 교수님 감사합니다.